Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth Gideon webinar. Today, we have our resident epidemiologist, Kimberly Hazel, and our co-founder, esteemed guest today, Dr. Stephen Berger, with us. Dr. Stephen Berger will be pitching in from the practical side of talking to anti-vaxxers and encouraging people to vaccinate. And Kim will lead the webinar today, covering rich history of anti-vaccination movements and vaccine hesitancy. Kim, over to you.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, we're going to be talking about a whole lot of different things. A lot of them going, down a timeline and things like that. But before we get started, I kind of want to put something in your guys' brain, and I kind of want to give you something to think about that I think is just very fascinating. And that's the idea that most people would say that science is based on evidence. But the reality is that for most people, it's really based on trust. And part of that is because your perception of anything can really change everything that you see. And there's actually a neuroscientific breakdown for why this happens. And it has to do with specific regions of the brain that become activated when you're presented with a new idea or new information that challenges your current perceptions. And while we're not talking about the neuroscience today, even though it's very fascinating, we are going to be talking a lot about mistrust and hesitancy. And I think starting from the thought process is that not everyone views science the same is really important and is a critical thing to keep in mind while we have this discussion today. I really want to start with talking about what vaccine hesitancy is and looking at it with a specific definition. So that definition is that vaccine hesitancy is the delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccination despite the wide availability of vaccination services. And in fact, in 2019, the World Health Organization actually recognized this as a complex condition that's also a top 10 threat to global health. So it is a big deal, and it is impacting a lot of people, and it's impacting the world as a whole at this point. And some of the reason for this hesitancy and this mistrust comes from political pressures, religious pressures, ethical, cultural, all these different things, even historical, which is some of what we're going to get into today. And all of these things make a huge difference in whether people decide to vaccinate or not. And some of it's also pop culture. I mean, there are a lot of very famous anti-vaxxers that have said some stuff or have spread some misinformation, either knowingly or unknowingly, and that's definitely impacted people's ideas and whether or not they're willing to vaccinate themselves or their families. Some of these people include Nicki Minaj, Rob Schneider, Jenny McCarthy, Jim Carrey, Charlie Sheen, Robert De Niro, and even Donald Trump. And that makes a world of difference when you consider the influence that these people have. But where did it all start, right? So to look at that, we have to start by looking at smallpox and some of the first smallpox outbreaks that we've ever seen. And for that, I like to use Gideon. If you've joined us before, you know I really love the outbreak maps. I don't know why, I just can't help myself. I absolutely adore them. I'm a very visual person, so I like it a lot. And the way that I like to get to them is because I'm so fascinated by diseases. I always start by looking at a disease note. So I go into our Explore module under diseases, and then I type in the relevant illness. From here, I can get a ton of information, which for someone like me, that's an epidemiologist, is very fascinating, such as reservoirs and stuff like that. But what I really like I said, is this outbreak map. And from here, I'm able to kind of see the impact that smallpox has had on the world. And if I look specifically at this year range, I'm able to see when our first modern outbreak happened, which was 1520. So we can see that it's impacted the world, right? And we know it started at 1520. And honestly, it really ravaged a lot of Western Europe during this time. I mean, you can see there's 33 outbreaks in that region of the world alone throughout history. And by 1763, we had started to see a lot of different attempts at inoculation. And while inoculation and vaccination actually has its origins in ancient China, there were a lot of people in Western Europe really trying to kind of curb the tide when it comes to smallpox and the smallpox epidemics that were happening. So specifically in 1763, we see that Paris's leading court actually rules that all medical providers and people must stop providing any type of vaccination or inoculation despite their ongoing epidemic. And some of that was because, yes, people were dying, right? Like the methods that we had at the time for inoculation were really not that safe. They weren't very effective. And so there was a lot of negative things associated with it, but a large majority of it was just the public outcry. that was associated with the fact that these were new, they were scary, and we didn't really understand what we were looking at. In fact, in history, vaccinations have been so contentious that it kind of wasn't that odd to hear people talking about them on public stages. In fact, in 1772, Reverend Edmund Massey, who was a very famous preacher at the time, delivered a specific sermon, a very famous sermon at that, that called smallpox inoculations diabolical operations that were an attempt to oppose God's punishment on man for his sins. And a lot of people took this to heart, and they fully believed that after this point that vaccinations were in fact kind of created by the devil and for evil purposes. So this led to a lot of people being very, very scared. But we were lucky because around 1800, Edward Jenner came up with the modern vaccine and started the modern vaccine era by creating his first smallpox vaccination that was proven effective. Not too long after that, the courts had agreed this was effective. This was definitely something that was good, and it was helping people. So they passed what was known as the 1853 Vaccination Act. This made inoculation of smallpox, vaccination for smallpox, specifically for infants, compulsory. This means that people had to get vaccinated. They had to get their children vaccinated. It was actually punishable by going to prison if they didn't. So if you were kind of scared of vaccinations, if you were still scared and you didn't understand them, and you had heard your preacher or famous preachers telling you that it was the work of the devil or it was evil, you could imagine that there were not a lot of happy people in response to the fact that now they were being forced by their government to actually take part in these vaccinations. So resistance to these laws was pretty much immediate and very violent. There was a lot of violent riots that went all throughout the UK. They spread pretty much far and wide, and within the same year, the very first anti-vaccination league was founded within London. And it didn't take long for that to spread. By 1879, we had the very first Anti-Vax Society of America that was founded by William Tebb. So William Tebb was a very, very loud proponent of anti-vax sentiment. He was what they called an anti-vaccinationist at the time, and he pretty much wanted nothing to do with vaccines when he was in the UK. And he brought all of that rhetoric with him into the United States, and it spread fairly quickly as well. But the good news is that our kind of powers that be at the time, the court decided, okay, maybe we were a little too harsh in our first law, and they went ahead and they actually made some amendments to the Vaccination Act. And in 1898, they removed the criminal penalties for not getting your family vaccinated, and they also included a conscientious objector clause. This is the first time that we see something like this in history, and it's had some really strong roots because we still see it in modern history today and in modern vaccination requirements and mandatory vaccinating today. And that's basically that parents who didn't believe in a vaccination's safety or efficacy could actually obtain some type of exemption certificate for their families and their children. So instead of being forced to always have these vaccinations with the penalty of actually having to go to prison, they were able to make that decision for themselves. A lot of people saw this as a return of their liberty and their freedoms, and it was received very well by the public, and a lot of that violence had stopped very shortly after that. So that's really awesome. As far as where the Anti-Vax League is today, while we don't necessarily have a group that, totes that same banner as they did in the 1800s, we do still have a lot of anti-vax organizations or organizations that are headed up by even some of those famous anti-vaxxers we talked about earlier, like Jenny McCarthy for one, that still go out and try to kind of create this distrust in vaccinations in general. But it's not all bad, because actually by the 1920s, we started to see decreases in things like diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis. And we started to kind of essentially win the battle against infectious diseases, which gave everyone kind of a renewed sense of surety and trust when it comes to medical issues in general and medical science at large. And we also saw that communications from scientific professionals were better than they had ever been before. And you can think about things such as the Spanish flu that were going on, and there was a lot of information put about the importance of washing your hands and wearing your mask and staying away from sick people and things like that. So we really started to make a difference, and the idea of public health started to kind of gain traction in general. And while we talk about the idea that some of these illnesses had kind of dipped, we can actually use Gideon to take a look at that. So when I'm in my map, I can do this really neat thing where I come up here and I can actually tell it what I want to look at without having to go back to my Explore note, which is super handy. So you can kind of get a visual idea of disease to disease. Since I know specifically that these illnesses were really dipping in UK between 1921 and 1939, I can go ahead and put that in my map. And as I put that in my map, we can see that a lot of the outbreaks that were going on with diphtheria specifically were happening here. But we also can list these outbreaks and see them and list them by year. And then we can look at the number of cases. So we can kind of see that things had sort of started to drop off around the 1920s in case numbers, which is awesome. So that's a really handy way that you can use Gideon to kind of look at and maybe get an idea for what the cultural impacts were at the time, just based on were there a lot of outbreaks going on of the specific illness at the time and how did it impact people. But of course, diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis were not the only illnesses going around during this time. And by 1939, we had a lot of major outbreaks of polio, specifically in the US. It was a big deal. It's talked about a lot. It was brought up a lot, and there's a good reason for it. Thing is, polio was unique compared to these other illnesses because we were coming off of those discoveries, right? We were coming off the things that gave the public confidence in medicine and medical sciences. We had these antibiotics, right? We had this great communication structure. We started to understand science as a community at large, and we started to trust the people in power that they knew what they were talking about, and our scientists were doing what was best for us. So as a result, when the polio vaccine finally did come out, a lot of people were more willing to get it than other vaccinations in history prior to this point. We can also kind of see the severity of polio and what was happening. And the way that I really like to do that is I like to go back to the Explorer. Again, I really like to look at the disease notes. If you don't, there are other ways that you can get to these things. I really like the disease notes also because we have this really awesome area that tells you synonyms that might be used globally, but we also have images of the time period. And if you're a medical history buff like me, especially the ones like polio, you can see some of these images that are kind of historically relevant, which is super cool. But from here, I like to navigate to this worldwide note, and within it, you could get a ton of information. And when I say a ton, I mean a metric ton of information. There's a lot in here that you can dig into, including a variety of charts that do different things. For our purposes right now, I kind of want to take us down to the notable outbreaks table. And this area will kind of show us some of the biggest outbreaks, the most well-known or the most significant that kind of stand out. Like I said, there's a lot here. You can see all these charts trying to populate as I scroll down. So there's a lot that you can take a look at. But again, we can look at this and we can see there were a lot of outbreaks going on for a very long time when it comes to polio. So we kind of see that severity. So aside from people trusting our scientists, right? And aside from people putting their faith in science, they also were really aware of the reality that polio was very scary. And there was cases of paralytic polio, and seeing your child impacted by that really had an effect on the community. And even if it wasn't your child, if it was any other children in the community, having that as a reality really made people more willing to get vaccinated than pretty much ever before. So in 1952, when Jonas Salk created the first effective polio vaccine, it spread like wildfire, especially in the US. It was huge. In fact, there was a mass inoculation of millions of children in the US, and it dramatically reduced polio prevalence by over tenfold during this time, which is huge. And then we had our first really major vaccination misstep with the Cutter incident. So if you're not familiar, the Cutter incident is probably one of the most infamous vaccination mishaps in history, and specifically in US history. So the correct list of ingredients for Salk's vaccination actually called for the polio virus in an inactive form. So they needed a killed or an inactivated version of virus. And in the Cutter facility, it turned out that their killing method was defective, which meant that they made an entire batch of vaccinations that had live active polio virus in them. And over 200,000 children received this batch of vaccinations. And of that group, 40,000 got polio. 200 were left with varying degrees of paralysis, and at least 10 had died, specifically from the result of getting this vaccination with a live poliovirus in it. As a result, polio vaccinations were actually temporarily halted in the US in 1955. So there was a time in which people were like, oh no, maybe we don't want to get vaccinated. And this led to a lot of mistrust coming back to the forefront and led to a lot more people, especially anti-vaxxers, saying, hey, see, we were right. You can't trust them. You can't trust what you're putting in your body. You don't know what it is, and you don't know if it's done correctly. And of course, this isn't the only misstep that we've made in medical history, and one that I think is very interesting, and that a lot of times people don't necessarily associate with vaccine hesitancy or hesitancy to care or anything like that, is the Tuskegee study. So you'll notice in our timeline that I sort of skipped one of these areas, and that was 1943. Well, if we actually flash back even further, in 1932, the United States started their Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. So this study essentially was designed in order for scientists to figure out if Black American males were going to respond differently to syphilis than white American males. And at the time, there wasn't a treatment for it. They were trying a variety of things. They wanted to test it out and so on and so forth. And so they were basically, trying to solve a problem, right? How do we treat syphilis, and how do we treat it in the different races and the different people within our country? The problem is that in 1943, penicillin was becoming very widely available, and it was found to be the treatment of choice for syphilis at the time. And yet those in the Tuskegee study were not given penicillin, and they were not given any kind of treatment. They were given placebos that were masquerading as treatments, and they were told, yes, you're receiving penicillin. Yes, you're receiving the vaccinations from these other illnesses that are happening right now. And in reality, they were receiving none of that. They weren't receiving any type of care at all. And instead, the scientists and researchers were simply watching to see what would happen, even though they could provide care for these patients. They chose not to. And we didn't actually hear about this as the public until 1972. And so we didn't actually know that this was going on for such a long time. It was kind of hidden and everything like that. And when it came out, there was pretty much radio silence from the US government for a time. There wasn't any type of formal apology or an explanation or anything happening until 1997, when President Bill Clinton actually issued a formal presidential apology. But a lot of people felt that that was too little too late. And I don't know if we can really blame them here. So as a result, there's actually a large portion of minority demographics that are very hesitant to get vaccinations, very hesitant to get treatments, and very hesitant to get new treatments, simply based on the idea that, how do I know that I'm not the one being experimented on? How do I know that my provider, that my scientists, that the medical scientists, that the government have my best interest at heart? And the reality is that 1972 was not that long ago. And 1997, when it was publicly addressed, is also not that long ago. So seeing this sentiment in these communities isn't really that surprising when you think about it. And it's well within the realm of realistic fears for them. It's very rational to be concerned about, do I trust these people? And do I trust what they're putting in my body to actually be what they say it is? And how do I know that it's correct? Right? So this has impacted a lot of things and led to a lot of present day problems, aside from the fact that there's already lack of access to adequate care, in these communities. There's also some issues when it comes to the availability of insurance and other different things within these minority communities. So then on top of that, they have to deal with this mistrust and this hesitancy. And of course, it doesn't stop there. We actually had Wakefield and his associates in 1998 publish a study that most people are pretty familiar with, or at least have heard of at this point. And the idea of this study was that a mercury-containing compound that was used as a preservative in vaccinations actually led to autism. The study essentially said if your kid gets vaccinated when they're young, if they're an infant, they're going to develop autism as a result of the vaccination. Despite the fact that this has been pretty much debunked a million ways to Sunday, right? It's been debunked. There's still a lot of people that are kind of hesitant to believe that it's actually been debunked, or that Wakefield and his colleagues weren't just silenced and that sort of thing. But in 2011, It was proven with concrete evidence that Wakefield and his associates committed medical and scientific fraud by falsifying data, and that their motivation was actually financial in nature, specifically being that their lead scientists in this group were receiving funding from lawyers that were acting on behalf of parents and other groups who were involved in lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers. So it's kind of one of those take everything you see with a grain of salt, right? You can't really necessarily trust it because in reality, he was receiving compensation. And the journal that published this study was actually pretty much has said we didn't really know, like we didn't know that that was the result. We didn't know that it was saying those things, and we shouldn't have ever published it. We made a mistake, and we shouldn't have done it. But the cat was out of the bag, and a lot of people read it, a lot of people bought into it, and at least 12 follow-up studies that involve millions of children have confirmed there is in fact no association between vaccines and autism. And yet still today, we have a lot of people that believe that. There's a lot of anecdotal stories going around, and there's also a lot of celebrities like Jenny McCarthy and her organization that still claim that Wakefield's assertions were true. So how do we counter it, right? How do we handle the misinformation, and how do we handle what's also known kind of lovingly and kind of not so lovingly by public health professionals as the infodemic, right? Just all of this information at our fingertips all the time that could be wrong, could be right. Who knows what you're going to get? One of the main ways that public health groups and public health officials are kind of tackling this issue right now is what they call the truth sandwich. So the truth sandwich is this idea that when someone comes to you and they kind of are telling you something that's incorrect or they're spreading misinformation, you first repeat the portion of the misinformation that's true. Second, you refute what's incorrect about it, and then you close with the truth. So an example of this would be, I have a friend that comes up to me and they say, you know, Kim, I'm done getting the flu shot because every time I get this flu shot, I get the flu. What's the point? I get the shot, and right after that, I get really sick, and it happens every single time. So I'm just going to take my chances with the flu. For me, the truth sandwich might look like, it's true you might feel bad after you get the shot. Then I can refute what's incorrect. But you're not actually getting the flu, as the shot that we have here in the US, specifically the one that's widespread in Indiana, is not going to give you the flu because it's not an active flu virus or anything like that within it. You're not going to actually get the flu from that. However, your body being sick or you not feeling well is actually the correct thing to happen. That's what you want your body to do when you get vaccinated, because it's your correct immune response taking place in order to better prepare you for you're encountering the flu later this season. A lot of times, the idea of addressing it that way is really meant to make it so that way people feel that they're on a level playing field, right? They don't feel talked down to, they won't feel condescended to, and they won't feel that what they've experienced or their anecdotal experience is incorrect. If you just kind of dismiss it right out of the gate, a lot of times people aren't listening anymore. There's this idea of intent and content, and if your intentions aren't clear, if they don't seem positive, and if they don't seem geared to be helpful, people are not going to trust your content that comes out of that. So the things that you say, right? If I just went up to my friend and I was like, okay, yeah, I'm sure that you got sick from the flu, I'm sure that's what happened, they're not going to listen to me, and they're not going to believe anything I say after that because now I've dismissed them, right? So that's kind of the idea behind the truth sandwich, and the idea that if we make people feel like they're on a level playing field, if we make people feel like they're not, you know, just being dumb or ridiculous, or they have some outlandish views, then they're more prone to listen to you. Another thing that public health officials are now currently doing is encouraging physicians and other health workers to use things like social media, as well as their own face-to-face interactions in their clinical practice in order to promote actual content. So as far as using social media, this can look like, you know, maybe you have your own personal LinkedIn and you share some stuff that's very factual and, you know, clean and cut and easy to understand for everybody from the CDC or the WHO or the NIH or these other trusted organizations that make people feel certain, and kind of spreading that to a wider audience. The other part of that, though, is engaging in conversation when someone asks a question. Again, answering in a way that doesn't put them down and doesn't condescend to them. But of course, we know that physicians' experiences are different, and that's part of why I've got Dr. Berger here with me today, is because the physician experience and the experience that care providers have when it comes to providing vaccinations and dealing with vaccine hesitancy is very, very different than some of the stuff that we've talked about so far, or looking at it at a high level. So, Dr. Berger, is there anything that you want to share off the bat? And of course, I've got some very interesting questions to ask you as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kim. I was fascinated by the history. And something interesting happened just 2 weeks ago or so. There was a gentleman named Ayman Zawahiri in Afghanistan who was targeted and eliminated, as they say. And he was a member of Al-Qaeda, and the story is well known to everybody. And some 10 years ago, 11 years by now, his associate, a guy named Osama bin Laden, went essentially the same path. One was in Afghanistan and one was in Pakistan. And people may not realize that as we speak, most of the cases of polio in the world are in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? And they're related to what you were talking about. When people went to get Osama bin Laden, they didn't know exactly where he was, and they had a house and they were suspicious, but they didn't know was he in the house. There were children in the house, and someone got actually a very bright idea. Let's send a doctor in who's going to do a vaccine upgrade for people in the area. We're going to give everybody hepatitis shots who hasn't gotten them, and he was going to go in the house and give shots to children. And in the needle now, if he gave shots to children, in the needle would be part of the child, some serum, some blood, or what have you, which always remains in the needle. Let's see if that specimen has the DNA of Osama. If they're his kids, then there's the DNA. It's a well-known story. The doctor, by the way, is still rotting in prison. I think the Pakistanis are just very upset about this, and they made up some other reason to put him in prison. After this happened, the story became well-known. And people in the area until today refuse to get vaccinated. They refuse to get vaccinated because everybody knows it's the CIA is coming to do something bad to us, and the vaccines are inherently bad and we're not going to get it. It's really true. This is the reason they don't get the vaccine. And therefore, this is why they get the disease. Speaking of vaccine hesitancy. And as I listen to people now who come in hesitating, if you will, with the vaccine, I try to make myself remember that I'm a doctor. I'm in the job of helping people and making them feel good. I've been in vaccines specifically for longer than many people. And vaccines, for the most part, are good. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that in a little while. Some are better than others. I'll tell you about that too. But until about 2 years ago, if someone came with another disease, that's when the corona started, was about 2 years ago. But if someone came with another disease, says, look, I'd say, look, you have an appendicitis. We're going to have to take out your appendix. We would get something called informed consent. It's sort of the same thing. And we'd say, well, we're going to take out your appendix, but you could have a reaction to the anesthetic. You can get an infection from the operation. You might bleed, bad things could happen. All in all, I would recommend that you get the operation to take out your appendix, because the chance of suffering from the appendix is clearly much higher than the chance of suffering from the procedure. And here I am 2 years later saying essentially the same thing, but the appendix now is coronavirus and the procedure is the shot. It's the same kind of thing. I'm giving informed consent. I'm laying out what may happen from the disease versus what may happen from the vaccine. And if the vaccine is cost effective, meaning that the cost of getting the disease is much higher than the chance of getting the vaccine, then clearly you should get the vaccine. When we were talking to people with appendicitis, there was no appendix hesitancy. We never ran into this. We didn't have movie stars saying, don't take out your appendix. It's a plot. The appendix industry is trying to make money off all of us. It doesn't exist as a disease and all this sort of thing. So this is all very new to us, but the bottom line is still the same. If we're in a situation where the coronavirus is much more likely to kill you, and the vaccine is much less likely to kill you or put you in a hospital and make you amazingly sick, well, you should opt for the vaccine. Having gotten the informed consent, we hopefully will influence them. We will convince them to do what I see as the right thing as a doctor. The problem also is here is that when we were talking with people who have appendicitis, there was no element of which culture are we in. You know, you burst your appendix in Africa, it's the same thing in the United States, same disease. Or what race they are, or the economic aspects of the appendix, or the religious aspects of the appendix. And these are all new things, and Kim has brought a lot of this up already. The politics are amazing. You know, if you belong to the wrong party, that means the wrong party means not the one I'm in. It means that if he's using a vaccine, it's clearly something you shouldn't be doing, just for that reason. And this should not be an issue. I'm not political, by the way, and it should not be in my discussion, but there we are. The person who is telling you in the media or in the newspaper or the movie star, as we said, or the person, is that person working because he wants to save lives? This is not brought out. It's not nice to say. But are these people really altruistic? Are they coming on your TV and on your media to save lives because it's good for humanity? I like to think that many are, but I also know that many are not. The psychology is interesting. I'm not a psychiatrist, but the ego aspect, the psychological aspect, the control aspect of going out there and having an audience and saying, I disagree. You know, we see that sometimes from our 6-year-old kids, but hopefully the guy might not be disagreeing now. Don't get a vaccine, mommy, because, you know, it's going to kill you. So even there are psychological aspects, sociological aspects. One other thing that's sort of interesting in history, and then I'll leave that particular point alone, is about 9 years before Osama bin Laden, there was an episode in Nigeria, and this brings something else up. Northern Nigeria suddenly had a huge outbreak of polio. Again, it's polio. And what happened there, some local health workers, we'll call them, became convinced for reasons that I'm sure are in their, you know, these were based on religion and culture, what have you. But they truly believed that polio vaccine was coming in from Europe, that was their take on it, to sterilize Muslim children in northern Nigeria. And children stopped getting the vaccine, and they truly believed this. There was a very brief time, really, where the children were not getting it. They also believed that it would interfere with the sexual function of Black men in Africa. Again, it was a plot of Europeans. And the bottom line is people are not getting the vaccine, and lo and behold, Nigeria had more cases than just about the rest of the world. There were, the incidence of polio in Nigeria went up 6-fold in the space of a year. Hundreds of cases at a time. Polio was already on a downtrend all over the world. So there we are. Again, the convincing of the person who's going to get the vaccine. In my world, it's based on facts, evidence, things that people don't want to deal with or can't deal with or are not qualified to deal with, frankly. But if you read over and over and over and over that the vaccine has clearly cut down hospitalizations, I'm talking about corona vaccine, the vaccine has clearly cut down on hospitalization and deaths. No matter how you cut the literature, you have to be on the side of the vaccine. The fact that someone got the vaccine and then had a side effect or something else unfortunate happened to them certainly happens, just as it does with the appendix, right? The person gets the appendix and maybe something bad happened. Sometimes it's based on just coincidence. Someone gets the vaccine and 2 days later he's struck by a car, and there are people who say, aha, you know, because he was struck by a car, right? I'll close with just what my epidemiology professor said on the first day of our course. He said, everybody who dies after he ate something. And again, is it causing the problem that you see? Is the vaccine causing the death or the heart problem? Or clearly there are side effects, but again, in numbers, it's almost silly, and it's hard to say that as a doctor. It's almost silly to compare the chance of getting the side effect versus the chance of dying the disease. One day when we don't have the disease, there's an argument, and that comes up with people in our field. You spoke at great length about smallpox. And in the 70s in America, if any in America, I was there at the time. In the 70s, we were still getting smallpox shots, but there was no smallpox. And you say, now there's an argument. And the smallpox shot clearly had side effects. It was not a pleasant thing. And if you're in a situation where the disease doesn't occur, well, you have a good argument. But we haven't reached that point, clearly haven't reached that point yet with corona.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that I always find fascinating is that there are still people that don't understand what a vaccine is, which, I mean, I guess for me, I've always been really into like medical stuff ever since I was very little. And so my parents always made learning about medicine very accessible, but I know that's not the case for everybody. So how often do you find yourself actually like having to explain what a vaccine is and why it's important for people to get it, like in your clinical experience?
That's a great question. Again, this, in the old days when we had appendix, we didn't have to explain what it meant. That's also sort of new. We find ourselves going into molecular biology just at the time of corona. It never happened to me before. And explaining what it is. Rightly, people are interested. They're fascinating. It's changed their lives. Clearly, they want to know about these things. It's hard sometimes to explain the differences between one vaccine to the other for this one disease. You may not know, many of you may not know, right now there are 88 vaccines out there in the world. There are vaccines that you've never heard about. There are vaccines against diseases you've never heard. Trust me on that. And these vaccines come out in 1,300 trade names. That's the number as of this morning. And get a handle. So what's the difference between this vaccine and because people see vaccines as one substance, and clearly there are all different. As I mentioned, some have worse side effects, some have no side effects. The bottom line for vaccines, there are two things in vaccinology. That's the specialty we're talking about. They're the vaccines which involve injecting a substance that is part of a pathogen meaning a bacterium, a virus, a parasite, or a fungus. We inject a portion of that, or sometimes the entire organism. There are vaccines made, you just boil up dead bacteria and inject that. It's as unpleasant as that sounds. There are a lot of vaccines and they work quite well. Or a portion of the bacteria, the virus, or what have you, into the body in a way that the body will recognize it as foreign and react against it as it does throughout our lives. Even without vaccines, you'll eat something throughout your life, you'll eat something, you'll be exposed to someone else who's sick, and there it is. It's in your body, and you're reacting exactly the same way as you would to a vaccine. And again, when someone is against vaccines, I have to remind, well, you're exposed, whether you're going to get that specific needle with the bacteria in it. You might have been exposed to the bacteria yesterday, having nothing to do with the needle. So one way or the other, you're getting it. The other type of vaccine, and I'm saying this quote, is to give the antibody itself. What your body makes is a kind of protein called an antibody. And sometimes instead of giving the vaccine and letting the body make the antibody, we just give the antibodies. There are lots of those out as well. Loosely speaking, those are vaccines as well. In the field of coronavirus, by the way, there are both. You can get the globulin, the antibody, and you would do that to someone where you just can't wait. The person's already getting sick. You're not going to wait around for him to make antibody in his body. That's going to take too long. So you can give him the ready-made antibody, as I say, an immune globulin, as we call it. Or if there's time to wait, of course, then you give him the vaccine and wait till his body makes it on its own.
Absolutely. And also, if you're still curious about vaccines in general, on the Gideon blog, we actually do have a guide to vaccines that covers more in detail some of the stuff that Dr. Berger was talking about as well. So we do invite you to see that if at all that's something that you're interested in and you want to hear more, some of the nitty gritty information and the different types of vaccines that exist out there. Again, always speaking of vaccines, what are some of the most common vaccine myths that you hear when you're providing medical care? What are like some of the kind of reasons that people might give for not getting it, or what are some of the most outlandish things that you've heard?
It's something I can't repeat actually, but there are two situations usually we're talking about. One is the child who grows up getting vaccines, as we all do, and our children do, and we go through that. And the vaccines, which clearly, first of all, can be given in childhood, because some can't. And they're against diseases that will occur in childhood. So we're not going to wait for them to grow old, to a nice ripe age where you want to give vaccines, because they, of course, they'll be damaged by then by the disease itself. The others are the vaccines which we give as boosters, meaning it's the same list essentially, but we have to update them every 5 years, 10 years, or what have you. And this could be because you're in a specific profession. For example, veterinarians have to get a rabies vaccine every 5 years. I don't know, most people don't know that, but they're dealing with rabies. You've heard of rabies. And rabies is going to kill you. I mean, that's one of the worst diseases ever. If you get rabies, you're dead. So it's a nice thing to do. Go get your vaccine every 5 years. Or tetanus, which is given every 10 years. And I've seen people who got tetanus because they waited longer than the 10 years. And then there are special situations like, as I say, industry, working with the diseases themselves, like running a laboratory, for example, or travelers. Travelers, that's become a sort of new specialty. A vaccination of travelers, also sort of a new specialty, starts around 1991. Every country's got travel clinics. I ran a travel clinic too. And there was one story that came up, I may have mentioned it to you before, but when people went to India, there's a debate of whether a person going to India should get a rabies vaccine. And again, it depends. Are you going to be in a situation where you're actually out in the street petting dogs or what have you? Maybe you should do that. It's a fatal disease. But what came up many times was people in my country love dogs. They'll pet dogs, and a dog with rabies looks really miserable. I mean, you just want to pet them. They're really not happy. And if you pet the dog and get bitten, I would tell them, well, now you have a risk of getting AIDS. By petting the dog in India, you have a risk of getting AIDS. You know why that is? Because you pet the dog, he bites you, and then you go to a clinic to get your rabies shots. You go to a clinic in India, in the old days at least, to get a rabies shot. What do you get from the needle? In an Indian needle in a clinic, you're going to get AIDS. So by petting that dog, you're going to get AIDS. You see, and it's connected dots. So sometimes it's very involved, very involved. In my clinic, just one story, and I'll leave you alone with all the stories. But in my clinic, we had over all the years, we had a total of 35,000 tourists, and 70% of the 35,000 were going to Thailand. It turns out that's a very popular a place for Israeli tourists. And I quit the clinic one day. Just passed it on to other people. And in the middle of the night, I get a phone call, and someone says, "I'm sorry to wake you up, but I was in your clinic a couple of months ago, and you may remember, I'm the guy. You may remember me. I'm the guy going to Thailand." And again, we had 35,000 people, and 70% are going to Thailand. And he said, "You may remember, I'm the guy going to Thailand." I said, "Yes, I remember you." And I tried not to laugh. And I said, "Well, why don't you call me in the morning, and we'll see what the problem was." So some of the calls were kind of interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do find that sometimes people will be like, "I have a question," and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you've got going on or what else is going on. It's time you got to answer this question. It's super important.
That's right.
In your personal experience, what's been the hardest part of combating the misinformation that's out there? Either in your clinic and face-to-face interactions, or just professionally through organizations like Gideon. And
that's the bottom line question. There's something. I once did philosophy, having nothing to do with anything except in the beginning of the philosophy course when I was an undergraduate, we were asked to look through the literature of religion and come back and prove that God exists. We were to stand up in the room and say, based on what we read, that Socrates said that, and other people say, St. Augustine said this, and we would stand up and prove that God exists. And the head of the course, a professor named Taylor, actually would argue with us, say, no, he doesn't exist. He would try to prove to us he didn't exist. And we'd back up our arguments with clearly people who knew better than all of us why they were saying it. And then he said, okay, now spend the next couple of weeks proving that God doesn't exist. And we would look up people who said that, you see the point. I wouldn't say that people who are anti-vax believe that God doesn't exist. But the point was that you could prove using very good literature and back it up with people saying whatever you want to prove your point. And there's something called a syllogism, which means that you're depending. First, you have a bias, because basically it starts with a bias, which is formed for God knows what reason, cultural, psychological. But you've got that bias, it's extremely strong. And you're going to look around for people who support your bias. You say, well, it's not just me, but you mentioned people in Hollywood or politicians, what have you. And you will back up the bias. That is the hardest part, because they will come at you with literature now. Not everybody, but they'll say, here's an article. I read a study in the New England Journal of Medicine or whatever it is. and hopefully they read it accurately. But there it is. They're proving it by what I had to do. They're proving that God exists by reading experts, and then they're proving he doesn't exist by. And we were the same people proving both. And the definitions they use are wrong. They're looking for the wrong information and therefore coming to the wrong conclusion. And if I'll stop because there are lots of long stories with that. But there was a famous Saint Anselm, who was in Canterbury in England in the 12th century, and his proof became known as the Superman proof. We ran into this, and what Saint Anselm said was, God is the greatest thing you can think of. God can do anything. He is infinitely good and infinitely smart and can do anything. By definition, he is the greatest thing in life. Now, if you say there's a God who does all those things but doesn't exist, you're saying, well, he's not great enough, because you could think of a God who can do all those things and he exists. So by saying that he's the greatest thing, you have now proven that he exists. You see what I've done? So by taking the definition and twisting it around, you have proven that God exists. And the same thing comes up in vaccines, that they're looking for the wrong endpoint of what a vaccine does. And now they try to prove that the vaccine, which had nothing to do with that endpoint, is a good thing because, or a bad thing, depending on which side you're on. It could be on both sides, right? By using a poor definition or a misdefinition, and then backing it up with people who accept that definition. And that's a long sentence to say this is what they're doing in my clinic. They're coming in with experts and committees and papers in the literature, and I read, and my cousin said, and I knew a guy, right? And these are the arguments you get. Believe me, with the appendix again, I never ran into that. It's only with Corona. It's very frustrating. It's if I could say, it's a holy work, because it is saving lives in my world, and the people I know do this, and I'm happy to be doing it. The arguments are no fun, but we have to do it.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate a lot of your insights and sort of the different ways that people look at things. Again, the very beginning, I posed that idea that for scientists and for most people, science is evidence, right? But for a lot of the general public, it's based upon trust. And that's kind of the gist of all of it, right? Is a lot of anti-vax sentiment and hesitancy comes from that mistrust, and kind of looking at where that mistrust comes from and how it plays a role, impacts everything that we do and everything that we see, and how we as providers or as educators or as companies or organizations can kind of change the conversation. And it really comes from a place of understanding, like Dr. Berger saying, the hardest part of it is understanding why they found this information, how they found it, and what does it mean, and how do I handle it, and that sort of stuff. And it's also knowing historically why there is some mistrust, and not, making people feel less than because they didn't understand something or because they're coming from a different perspective than you have. Again, thank you, Dr. Berger, for your time. Really, really awesome to get to talk with you and hang out for a little bit. Christina, we're ready to open it up for Q&A. I haven't seen too many come through, but if anybody's got questions, now's the time.
Absolutely, guys. Please go ahead. You can raise your hands. You can type in the chat or use the QA box, and we are ready to answer any questions you have. I did answer one in writing. So someone asked, are these resources free or do they require a subscription? So to answer your question, the infographic, the timeline that you've seen today, will be shared with you after the call when we email out the webinar recording. However, the Gideon database itself does have an annual subscription attached to it, but depending on your particular circumstances, we can provide discounts. So I've put some information into the Q&A. If you want to find out more, there are details in there. Any other questions beyond the subscription? I will thank you all very much. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot. And guys, thank you very much for attending and being such a wonderful, attentive audience.